Painting light and shadow for Painting light and shadow for beginners, part 1. A single light source, or whatever. Pretend for a moment that the sun has a gun, a sun gun, or sun for short, and they're pointing it at the earth, and also they're holding it sideways because it's a kill shot, and also, it's not even a regular sideways hold because it's a death the kid pull the trigger with their pinky style grip, and then they're like, happy Sunday, and shoot a solid that's a sun bullet directly at the earth, but the earth is like, you fool, I'm the main character here, and then they summon legendary armor made of titanium growlophiline, so the bullet bounces right back at the sun like, and then in their final moments, they look up at the sky and go, j'ai rêvé d'un rêve. Et maintenant, ce rêve est parti de moi. Hang on, I lost the plot to this. Let me just... Oh, right, the bounds. That's the important part. Okay, so, if the solid had hit the Earth anywhere other than that center, then it would have bounced in a completely different direction. And now you know the basics of how light rays work. Let's take that knowledge and see how they can help us paint light and shadow. So look, I'm about to explain some mechanics of how lighting works, and I strongly recommend that you learn about that. But if you're just here to watch the tutorial on Photoshop or Clip Studio Paint, feel free to skip to this time code so I don't bore you with all the low-key nerd stuff. As for the rest of you, let's take a look at a single light source and how that affects a form sitting in a void. Quick disclaimer, by the way, nothing that I'm explaining here is scientifically sound. I'm just giving you a way to visualize this so you can think your way through your work. If you really want to learn about lighting mechanics and all of that, please look somewhere else. So, let's get started. We're going to analyze a picture of television's real-life Earth, and you'll notice a couple of things here. One, the transition from light to shadow, at least on a spheroid, is fast. I've seen more than a few tutorials out there say you can just paint a smooth gradient from light to dark across the ball, but that's flat earth propaganda. Don't believe their lies. It's a quick and clean drop-off.
Objection, Your Honor.
Ow!
If you make the light source really big relative to the object in question, you can clearly see how the transition smooths out into more of a gradient.
Okay, look, yes, technically that's true, but also that's a lot closer to what we call ambient lighting, and we'll talk about that in another video. This one's about lighting that's very directional and no other factors. Aight? And then the dark side is uniformly dark. There's no light hitting this at any point, which means there are no gradations of any kind. Now looking back at the bright side, it appears to also be uniform. It's not really, and I'll show you why in a moment, but it's important to know because painting uniform light is usually going to be more convincing than a gradient going down the entire form, so keep that in mind. The fourth and last thing I want you to notice is that if you look right here, there is a subtle brightness, and that's called a specular highlight. If this Earth was really shiny, like really shiny, there would probably be a white spot right about here. And I'll explain what that is in a sec. I've gone ahead and recreated the setup in a 3D program, which you can do yourself if you want to toy with this concept. It's just a sphere and a black void and one single directional light source. Without all the detail, you can see that indeed there is a tiny subtle bit of light decay that's happening around the sides, and if we reduce the roughness of the material, you can see the hot spot appear right where I estimated that it would. Now, the bright side of this will always look more or less consistent regardless of where you're looking at it from, and that's because what you're seeing here is the parts of the surface that are being lit and how much light they're getting, and that's not something that's physically going to change based on your vantage point. Think of it like this. If your light rays are uniformly spread out, then the area that's facing the light direction will receive a strong concentration of them, but areas that turn away get less rays and there is more space between them. As for the specular highlight, that's never going to be in the same place twice because its location is relative to the viewer. And the way that works is that a given concentration of light rays will always be shooting directly into your retinas regardless of where you are in space. So that was a single light source. We're going to talk about ambient lighting, bound lighting, and then occlusion in the next video, but let's put this into practice so you can get a better feel for it, yeah? I did a quick drawing of Nazareth Crown from my webcomic Supercell, which you should totally read by the way, because he's made of nice geometric shapes and will make a good example to work with. There's a link in the text thingy below the video where you can download this file if you'd like to follow along. Okay, so the first step is to establish where your light is actually coming from. I'm going to do 3 examples here, one with the light coming from here-ish, one with the light coming from here-ish, and then one coming from the back. Step 2 is to set up your work layers however suits you. Here's how I normally do it. I use a layer to darken the whole thing and make it a bit more uniform so we can focus just on lighting information and not just color. You could even go so far as to use a middle gray for this if it's more comfortable, but I like having at least a little bit of color showing through. And then for my light pass, I like to have a folder set to screen or add or soft light or whatever gets you closest to what you're looking for and do all of the lighting work in there. This folder setup is handy because unlike using two screen layers on top of each other, which just keeps multiplying the effect, you can have two normal layers that work with each other as if they were part of the same layer. There's also a trick you can do here if you want to cut into the lighting, but you don't want to mess up the work you've already done in that area. You can use a layer above that and paint in black, and that will subtract from the overall effect without destroying the work you've done. And once you're happy with how that looks, if you don't want that layer hanging around, you can just make a selection out of it and clear it from the layers below. I think it's neat. For step 3, using what we know about lights, grab a brush of your choosing and go block out the areas where you think the light is going to be hitting. Normally I'd use my own custom brushes for this part, but for this example I'm going to wield a medium hardness round brush with no pressure sensitivity so we can all be on the same page. In another video we'll talk about detailing things like texture and ambient occlusion and all that, but don't worry about it for the time being. For this part you're also not painting specular highlights just yet. Focus on whether there is light hitting the surface or not. This will probably feel weird and artificial, but as you work with it more you'll get a better feel for the process and make it your own. Step 4. Once you've established your light areas, go in and add subtle gradations in places where the surfaces start to turn away from the light, and more importantly, where that drop off into darkness is actually going to happen. You can do this part however you like. Some people choose to use blending brushes or blur brushes or erasers. Personally, I just like to set the same brush that I'm working with to transparent. So it's up to you, figure out what feels natural. And if you guys are curious about those things individually, I can always make a video about that. Step 5. I like to use an add layer for this, but you can start placing specular highlights in places where you think they will be. You can safely estimate them without it looking too bad, honestly, but if you want to try to be a little bit more accurate, a good rule of thumb is that they will fall in areas that are facing slightly away from you and toward the light. Figuring out how to render something in a way that conveys believable form is going to come down to practice. You're likely going to need to familiarize yourself with the brush settings so you can customize them to your preference, as well as develop the hand-eye coordination necessary to wield them properly. I can always make videos on that at some point, but the most important thing, I think, is going to be developing your own critical eye, observing how light falls on objects around you in real life, how other artists interpret certain things, and how you might be able to recreate those effects, etc. I definitely encourage you to keep doing these exercises and really trying to understand what a single light does and what its relationship is with a form. It'll be helpful for the next video where we'll take a look at things like ambient lighting and multiple light sources and so on. Spoilers, it's kind of like if you took these 3 examples and overlaid them on top of each other. Dun dun dun! Anyway, I hope you learned something from this video and that you'll check out the next one. I'm still getting a handle on all these YouTube things, like how apparently the last 30 seconds of a video have extra features you can toy with, so I'm gonna go try and figure that out. In the meantime, here's a bunch of links. They're also in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed the video, and take care everybody.